All right, so just a reminder, this is our last class because we do not have class on Friday. I will not be here. Study guide is on Blackboard, and the exam is on Monday, right? Also, if you get a chance, take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation form for the course. I noticed so far we have a 0% return rate on the evaluation. So,
where is it?
didn't you get an email? Don't you get an email on that?
I got one, but they said it was like too late. Maybe I read it wrong.
As far as I know, it's still open. So, yeah. Did you guys get an email?
Yeah.
Evaluations? Really? All right. Well, if it's not open, it's not open. Have you got it for other classes? Or?
Well, you just have your other class.
Yeah.
I got it for that too.
You did?
I think so.
All right. In any case, if you can, appreciate it. Okay, so what we're going to do today is try to make sense of the American Civil War in one class. Let's see how far we get. All right, so this is obviously, one of the most significant events in American history. It is, as we talked about a little bit the last day, an event which still defines how people think about themselves in the context of the United States. It certainly raised a host of issues which are still very much debated in American life today. Most importantly, the balance between federal and state power. In the short term, the Civil War would resolve many issues. Right? The victory of the North in the Civil War will end slavery. Right? It will lead to a revision of the Constitution. Right? The next phase after this period in history, which we won't cover, but would be the first part. Say, if you were to take the second half of the survey, you would start by looking at what's known as Reconstruction and the process of rebuilding America after the Civil War. Well, part of that was reconstructing the U.S. Constitution. Right? 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution ended slavery, granted citizenship to the former slave population, and guaranteed their rights, particularly their right to vote. Right? Well, we're still debating these things today, particularly the 14th Amendment is debated today, largely in the context of immigration, and who gets to be an American. Does it just have to be born here, and so on. So it resolved a lot of issues in the short term, right? And it certainly transformed America in the short term, and it was revolutionary in a sense, which is why many people called the aftermath of the Civil War the Second American Revolution. But a lot of the issues which it resolved, I would argue, were tamped down and have kind of bubbled to the surface again, rather than being completely expunged from the story of American history. In terms of the war itself, this was a brutal, bloody, awful affair. The worst war in American history. Right? More Americans died and were injured in the Civil War than any other military conflict the United States has ever been involved in. And that's saying a lot, because the United States has been involved in a lot of military conflicts. Right? This was the worst. It was the first industrial war, arguably in world history. The first war in which modern weaponry, the weapons which industrial manufacturing were capable of creating, were used. Right? This is only 150 years ago. Right? I think what we've seen in the last 150 years is the incredible ability of industrial power to manufacture weaponry. Right? We've gone from what were revolutionary weapons in the Civil War, like these massive iron cast mortars, right? Which could fire, you know, siege weapons which you'd never seen before, right? Which could fire great distances and put artillery well behind the lines of the enemy. We've gone from there to, you know, weapons today which can destroy the planet, and you know, missiles which can travel around the circumference of the Earth. Right? In 1861, these were the most destructive weapons the world had ever seen. And during the course of the war, the technology would speed up rapidly. For example, a lot of soldiers who went out into the field in 1861 you know, were firing essentially upgraded muskets, right? Guns which weren't that different from what their grandfathers had used in the Revolutionary War. By the end of the war, you had breech-loading rifles and you know, the prototype of the machine gun. You had things like the submarine appear for the first time in ironclad ships. Right? All of these things were new innovations brought out during the war. And so, to a certain degree, one of the key factors in Northern victory is going to be that they are the more industrialized and more economically capable side in this conflict than the South. As I said, it's probably the most destructive war, definitely the most destructive war in American history. 750,000 Americans died in the American Civil War. The bloodiest battles in American history were fought during the American Civil War. You know, not just the bloodiest single battle, but somewhere in the region of the top 10, almost all of them are Civil War battles. And more Americans died at places like Antietam and Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Gettysburg than in you know, the major battles of World War II in either the Pacific or Europe. An awful lot of the death toll was of disease. Right? People died of cholera and of influenza and of typhoid, and a lot of people died because of infections from wounds and so forth. And these numbers don't even reflect the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands who were wounded but survived. Right? People who lost limbs, lost eyesight, lost you know, the capacity to physically function. And you know, today, think about this. American casualties in war are very low today. American death casualties in war. Right? We just fought 10 years of war in 2 different countries, and U.S. casualty rates were death rates were under 10,000, right? Well under 10,000. But the amount of people injured in Iraq and Afghanistan is very, very high, right? Considerably higher. In other words, my point is, you're still very likely to get more, you know, to be extremely injured in war. Today, we have artificial limbs, rehabilitation. You know, the people who were injured in the Civil War had none of that. The other thing I think which is kind of interesting too is that, you know, today we understand the long-term impact of war on people psychologically, right? We understand PTSD, we understand we may not treat it effectively or address it properly politically, but we understand that people come out of war psychologically as well as physically injured. And you know, so many Americans fought in the Civil War. You can imagine the long-term residual effect of this. In terms of the war itself, all the cards were with the North. They had more people, they had more resources, they had better infrastructure. You know, this being the first industrial war, it's the first time railroads, for example, are used to move troops and heavy artillery. Right? Huge advantage here to the North. They can move people much more quickly. And they can, you know, supply battle or armies in the field much more effectively. But to a certain degree, that advantage the North had in terms of industrial capability was also slightly reversed when you realized that most of the war was fought in the South. Right? And so essentially the capacity for movement and capacity to supply troops in the field was diminished for the Union armies by the fact that most of the major battles were fought in the South. And to a certain degree, this was a war in which the North invaded the South. Right? We talked about it a little bit the last day. Southerners came to see this as the war of northern aggression. Right? They came to see it as a war in which their country was invaded by another country. Right? The United States, or the Union, invaded the Confederacy. Right? For Union supporters and for people in the North, this wasn't an invasion of another country. This was an effort to take back what had been stolen. Right? The South had been illegally removed. Right? But that fact that most of the fighting takes place in the South is going to be one of the key factors which kind of cancels out much of the advantage which the North has in terms of manpower and resources. And the Northern strategy was fairly simple. The Northern strategy was called the Anaconda strategy, and it was devised by Winfield Scott, who was you know, the most senior general in the United States Army, a hero of the Mexican War, but by this point an elderly and very large man who wouldn't spend much time outside of Washington, D.C. And to a certain degree, once again, I'll talk about this in a moment, but that's one of the disadvantages the North had, is that their most experienced officers were often incapable or too old or too advanced in years to take to the field. But in any case, Winfield Scott's strategy was to treat the South, for the North to treat the South like an anaconda would treat its prey. Right? So how does an anaconda kill its prey?
Suffocate?
Right? Coils itself around its prey and squeezes it to death. Right? Suffocation would be obviously the cause of death, right? So the North basically concluded, look, we have all of these tremendous advantages. We can surround the South and slowly crush it. Right? So first thing we're going to do is blockade. Right? All the naval supremacy is with the North. Right? Most of the United States Navy stays loyal to the Union. Most of it was concentrated in the North in any case. And so this strategy is very important because, of course, the South's major strategy is based on cotton. Right? The South believes it can survive as an independent country because of the importance of King Cotton. Now, they're not going to sell their cotton to the North anymore, but they're going to sell it to Britain and France. And if they can get Britain and France to buy their cotton, then they can purchase they'll have the cash basically to purchase the weaponry which they can't produce themselves to fight this war. And also makes their economy sustainable. If you can stop that cotton from getting out and stop other imports from getting in, then you can basically economically, prevent the South from waging war and make it impossible for the Confederacy to function as an independent state. So the blockade is kind of one key part of the strategy, right? The other part of the strategy is then to use the Union's superior manpower, and you can see up here, in terms of workers and factories and railroads, and its economic resources to gradually take out the main kind of elements of the new Confederacy. So one part of the strategy was to take control of the Mississippi River. Right? If you take control of the Mississippi River, not only do you compound this economic siege, but you cut off the Confederacy. You cut off Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas from the other part of the Confederacy. Right? And you cripple one of its main economic arteries, the Mississippi River. And then the third part of the strategy was to basically go straight to the heart of the Confederacy and capture the capital of Richmond in Virginia. Right? And if you did those three things, right, you blockade, you take the Mississippi, you capture the capital, then you can gradually squeeze the real life out of the Confederacy. South Carolina and the Deep South, you can just slowly, like a snake, coil yourself around it and kill it. Right? So that was the basic strategy. As far as people like Winfield Scott and the planners were concerned, this would be relatively quick, right? Because all of the resources lay with the North, right? All the factories, all of the workers, all the railroad tracks, more troops in the field, and better equipped, and so on and so forth, right? Maybe a year, maybe at the most 2, right? Well, that's not the way things happened, right? The war went on for 4 years, right? In fact, in the first year of the war, all the success was with the Confederacy. And all the early battles were won by the Confederacy. So if we look at particularly the main theater, and here you can see the Virginia theater, right, where most of the war was largely won and fought, or at least most of the major battles were fought in this area. The red explosions represent Confederate victories, right? Of one Union victory in the period from 1861 to 1862. All the others are Confederate victories. Right? The first major battle here was the first Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. It's right outside Washington, D.C. And people actually came out from D.C. and sat on the hill to watch the battle. And people brought out their picnic baskets and sat on the hill and figured this will be great entertainment. We'll watch the Union Army send those, rebels running back to the South, and it'll all be over very quickly. And what happened at the first Battle of Bull Run, of course, the opposite. Union soldiers experienced for the first time what became known as the Rebel Yell. These crazy Southern Confederates who were imbued with a spirit which surprised people in the North, drove the Union Army from the field and sent them literally running back into Washington, D.C., along with all those people that come out to spectate. Right? It was a huge psychological blow to the Union, and it was the first time many people in the North realized, my God, these people are serious. And not only are they serious, but they're extremely motivated, and they're willing to fight and die and to a degree which we didn't really anticipate. Right? And everywhere Union armies encountered Confederates in this period, they lost. Right? It's only by the spring of 1862, places like Yorktown and Merrimack, that you start to see major victories. And of course, the first real kind of significant victory the Union experiences of any great significance is Antietam in 1862, which I'll talk about in a second. That was significant because it was actually fought in the first major battle fought in Union territory. By that point, the Confederates were so, Confederate Army was so successful that they were taking the battle into Union territories, right? But Antietam was a Union victory only because they had more people in the field. Right? The amount of people who died at Antietam is the single deadliest battle in American military history. And it was simply a Union victory because they had more people to kill than the Confederates did in that particular field. It was kind of a Pyrrhic victory. They lost a huge amount of troops. So the bottom line about all of this is that the Anaconda strategy and this concept of a quick and easy victory didn't occur, right? And so you have to ask yourself why. Why would the Union, which have all of these advantages, not win easily? Why would the Anaconda strategy not work? What enables the Confederacy to be so successful on the battlefield?
Is it because they have slaves?
To a certain degree, right? What advantage does slavery give to the South?
Well, it's extra bodies, like people to do more labor for them.
And if you have all those people to do labor, what do
You can put out more soldiers.
right? It frees up. Southern volunteers, young men who want to go volunteer and fight. The other thing you've got to keep in mind about this is that when this war began, all the soldiers were volunteers, right? On both sides. Right? Now, the United States had an army, but it was an army of 30,000 soldiers. Right? A drop in the bucket in terms of those who would actually serve in the Civil War. Almost all the people who fought in the Civil War were volunteers, right? Initially. And in those first 2 years, they were almost all volunteers. Right? So if you have, in the South, you have a slave population which can carry the labor load and do the work that people would normally do themselves, then you can free up people to go fight in the war. And remember, not all, only about a third of white people in the South actually own slaves, right? So, slave population enabled non-slave owning agriculture to function through this period. Okay, so that's one factor. What else would explain Southern success?
Most of the generals were in the South.
Most of the successful generals were in the Confederate Army. All the best officers, not just generals, right, but officers. Generals are important in terms of strategy and to a certain degree battlefield leadership. But if you think about organizing and training and volunteer soldiers, getting them ready to fight, leading them actually on the battlefield, right? From general down through the rank, colonels, captains, lieutenants. Right? The Southern Army, the Confederate Army, had far superior officers. Right? Why would that be?
The military schools were mostly in the South.
Right, remember we talked about this, the old South, Southern culture, that if you're a young plantation gentleman and your high school experience is basically a military finishing school, a Virginia Military Institute or a Citadel or, and then, a lot of them would go on to West Point, right? So at the time the war breaks out, officers in the United States Army have to make a decision. Am I going to fight with the Confederacy or am I going to fight with the Union Army, which I served with? A lot of Union Army officers left and fought with the Confederacy. So there were more West Point graduates in the Confederate Army than there were in the Union Army. So that's another factor. They were better led. They were better organized. Maybe not as well equipped, but they were They were better led. What other factors might explain Southern success on the battlefield?
Well, since most of the battles were in the South, they had home field advantage.
They know the area, right? Although, to a certain degree, if you look at these battles, like, any of these battles in Virginia, you're going to have, in these Confederate armies, you're going to have Virginia regiments, of course. But you're also going to have Mississippi, and all the regiments were organized around based on state. You're going to have Mississippi and Alabama and Florida, Texas regiments fighting in these fields. But definitely kind of home comfort, if you will, home field advantage plays a role. And there's another element in that too. It's not,
They're defending.
right. You feel like you're defending your home territory, right? So this concept of the War of Northern Aggression, right, is very important to understand in the Confederacy. This concept that the North has invaded the South. This is our land that they're trying to take away. That the Northerners are foreigners. And I would encourage you to think back here to where we started in the Revolutionary War. Remember Joseph Plum Martin, who we talked about, this foot soldier in the Revolutionary War, who talked about people from other colonies being foreigners, right? This idea of regional identity is still very strong in America in this period, right? So, Robert E. Lee, who I'll talk about in a second, one of the great generals of the Confederate Army, publicly said, look, I'm going to fight with the Confederacy, not because I necessarily believe in slavery, but because I believe in Virginia. Right? I'm fighting for Virginia. A lot of Southerners had this attitude, right? They were fighting to defend the South, right? And there's one other element to this too, right? Think about, we talked about the Preston Brooks episode, right? Where Preston Brooks beat Charles Sumner with the cane in Congress, right? And a lot of Southerners applauded him for that. Why? What was he doing in their minds?
Taking up the South and the way of life, their beliefs.
Defending their
honor.
Right? Southern males in particular, and this is not just speculation on the part of historians, right? This is based on reading the letters that they would write home to their family members. They constantly talked about defending the honor of the South, right? Against Yankee, incursions and all this kind of stuff that, we can't let these Yankees come down here and they're gonna occupy our land, they're gonna rape our women, they're going to free our slaves, right? They're going to challenge the honor of our, impugn our honor. It's built into Southern culture that when someone challenges your honor, you take forceful action. You either beat them with a cane or you challenge them to a duel. So for young Southern men, if the honor of the South is being impugned, there's no question about it. You go take up arms and you go out and fight and die if necessary. And so I guess the point would be, if you look at these early battles of the war and you're looking at it thinking, okay, you got volunteers on one side and volunteers on the other, yet the volunteers on the Confederate side are fighting harder, they're winning more, they're sacrificing more. Their motivation is clearly higher than on the Union side. And of course, better leadership, I think, is a key factor. Now, going back to Antietam here, right? Antietam is a major kind of turning point, right? Because Abraham Lincoln was devastated that the war was going so poorly. Right? He was alarmed, right? As were many people in the North, that what they thought would be an easy victory was not, and would not turn out to be so. Lincoln actually, visited several battlefields in the South to meet with his generals and to encourage them, look, fight harder, be more aggressive, right? And here you can see Lincoln, who was unusually tall by the standards of the 1860s. He's meeting with George McClellan, who was, by that point in 1862, his third commanding general of these armies in Northern Virginia. Right? And he basically went down there to berate McClellan. He said, why, because McClellan faced up against the armies of Northern Virginia, the Confederate armies, which were at this point being led by Robert E. Lee. And, you saw all those victories I just showed you. As far as Lincoln was concerned, McClellan, appeared to be ducking and running. He had more men in every battle, but he never used them effectively. And Lincoln was deeply frustrated. Right? He felt like his officers, his generals were not getting it done. And meanwhile, politically back home, there were a lot of people in the North by this point, by 1862, who were saying, let's just cut a deal with the South. Let's just get out of the war, compromise, right? This cartoon is actually a critique of that concept, right? It's from Harper's Weekly, which is a pro-union magazine, and it's criticizing those people who called for compromise. You can see the American flag upside down, and Union soldier bowing his head, kind of shamefully compromising with the Confederate. But it's always important to remember, I showed you the last day that in the South you had all those counties that voted against secession. Well, in the North, there were plenty of people who didn't believe that the South should be forced back into the Union by war. And many of them were Democrats, right? Remember, Lincoln was a Republican. The Democratic Party in the North largely wanted to cut a deal with the South, right? And compromise, right? Maybe even accept the existence of the Confederacy. Some people argued, let them back in and we'll promise not to do anything about slavery. Right? But by 1862, Lincoln had decided, look, we have got to change the whole narrative of this conflict. Right? It can't any longer just be a conflict about the North against the South, or Northern aggression against the South, or even just a war about the Union or about states' rights or any of these other issues. It's got to be a war in which there's a clear moral distinction between who's on the right side and who's on the wrong side. Right? And so Lincoln, by 1862, has come to the conclusion that the elephant in the room has to be put front and center. Right? And of course, the elephant in the room is slavery. Right? No one's talked about it at this point. No one's made it the issue of the war. People are talking about the Union and the South. And Lincoln says it's time to make slavery the major issue. But he knows it's an explosive issue even in the North. Right? Many Northerners will not fight and die just to free black people from slavery. Right? He has to attach this concept to momentum. Right? He has to have a victory. He has to have some sign that he can give to people in the North. We're turning this around, we're winning. And in doing that, we're going to make this a moral crusade to end slavery. So Antietam is the turning point, right? It's the first time Lincoln's able to point to the battlefield and say, look, we're winning, things are turning around. Right? And as soon as Antietam occurs, he makes the decision to move on the issue of slavery, right? And issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Right? Now remember, Lincoln came into the White House convinced that slavery was evil, but not convinced that he could do anything about it in the South. Right? Even when the war began, Lincoln's view was, I have no authority to end slavery. Right? The war is simply about bringing the Union back together. Right? Lincoln believed the only authority of the federal government on the issue of slavery was to stop it from expanding into Western territories. Right? But he did view slavery as immoral, and he did feel empathy, which many white Northerners didn't necessarily, for the enslaved population of the South. Right? And so his thinking evolves between 1860 and 1862. It evolves within the context of the war. By 1862, he's come to the conclusion that this war has to be a war to end slavery permanently. And there can't be any equivocation on this issue. Right? But once again, he's very constrained by what he sees as the authority of the president to do anything about this. So the Emancipation Proclamation is a really kind of interesting study in how Lincoln operated within the confines of the war, but also the U.S. Constitution. Right? He issued the proclamation in 1862. It goes into effect on January 1st, 1863. Right? To abolitionists and anti-slavery people, this was the greatest moment in American history. It's certainly the key moment in the Civil War. Right? To critics, to people in the South, of course, Lincoln had made a pact with the devil. Right? This is a Southern image of the Emancipation Proclamation. You can see the devil's inkwell here. Lincoln has dipped into it to sign the proclamation. What's particularly interesting, well, you can also see demonic Lincoln in the background. But this image here is projects an image of Lincoln in the Oval Office and a large painting of the Haitian Revolution on the wall. Right? And the Haitian Revolution to Southerners was the poster child of what would happen to America if you ended slavery. Black people would take over, they would run the country, they would drive out the whites, and they would exact revenge and all of these horror stories which Southerners projected would come to light. But even in the North, Lincoln had his critics, right? Northern Democrats began to call Lincoln Abraham Africanus, right? And started to spread all this stuff about miscegenation of black and white, people having children together, and how America's race identity would be destroyed, right? Mongrelized, and there was a huge backlash from his critics in the North. So to issue the Emancipation Proclamation with no, it was a huge thing. It was a major, major turning point. But it was also limited in scope. There's a perception that what Lincoln did in 1862 with a stroke of a pen was free all the slaves. And that's not what happened. Right? What did Lincoln do in the Emancipation Proclamation?
They declared all slaves in the South free.
Right. He declared all those states in the 11 states which seceded from the Union to be free. Right? What that meant, in fact, was that there were slaves in the Union. There were slave states in the Union: Kentucky and Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, West Virginia. Those people were not freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. Right? So slavery continued to exist even after the Emancipation Proclamation. So why did Lincoln free the slaves in the South, but not the slaves in the North?
It was to make a statement, really.
Okay, part of it is to make a statement. Who's the statement intended for?
The South.
In part the South, but at this point Lincoln has reached a point where he knows the South is not going to accept his moral guidance on the issue of slavery.
It's for the North. It's trying to raise morale.
Right, in part it's for the people of the North to basically say, look, we're fighting for something bigger here than territorial politics. We're fighting for the very essence of what we understand American identity to be: freedom. Right? And we're fighting for a moral cause, right? A cause worth dying for, the way that Southerners are willing to die for their cause. Right? So part of it is to galvanize the North and make this clear Manichean struggle between good and evil, good North, bad South. Right? That message is for Northerners, but it's also for the broader world community. Lincoln wants to send a message to Britain in particular and say, you can't buy Southern cotton. If you buy Southern cotton, you're upholding an evil institution, right? An immoral institution. Right? Can't support the Confederacy. Right? And at this point, the British and the French were kind of sitting on the fence on this issue. Right? Who would they support? Would they accept the Confederacy? Right? It's obviously also a message for the African American population in the South. Right? Stop working. You know, you're no longer slaves. You're free. Right? It's an effort to take away the key advantage the Southerners have. If they don't have slaves anymore, then they don't have a labor force. And they can't continue the war. But why does he only do it in the South and not in those slave states that were still in the Union? Why not free the slaves in Kentucky and Tennessee?
That would create a tear in the Union states, where slave states in the Union, they don't want those taken away.
To a certain degree, he doesn't want to tick off Kentuckians, right? He doesn't want to make them angry towards the Union to a certain degree, but there's a legal issue for it. It's the same reason Lincoln didn't emancipate the slaves when he came into office in the first place. He did not believe he had the constitutional authority to do it. Right? So why does he have the constitutional authority to do it in the Confederacy then?
Because they had separated?
Because those states, were in open rebellion against the government, and therefore they had lost their rights as states under the Constitution. Right? They were in legal limbo, in other words. And so Lincoln basically figured it's a legal loophole, right? He didn't walk into it. And remember, this is very important because I think it's one of the things that makes Lincoln such a hugely significant president. People talk about this and say, well, Lincoln bottled on the issue of emancipation because he wouldn't force Kentucky and Missouri to give up slavery. But ultimately what Lincoln did is he found a way to address this issue without transforming the American system. Right? And I think, to a certain degree, he was able to make a constitutional argument here that I have the authority to do this. So it's a very complex, very well kind of thought out, but explosive issue. And it had an enormous impact. It did transform the war. And one of the major things it enabled Lincoln to do was do something which no one had done at this point in the war, arm African Americans. Right? Southerners wouldn't do it. Right? They're not going to let slaves fight. Right? And most slaves wouldn't fight for them anyhow. Right? What Lincoln had found, and part of the pressure on emancipation too, was that in those areas where Union armies had won some success, in the Mississippi Valley, for example, or in parts of Virginia, where they had actually won Southern territory, slaves were already running away, and they were joining the Union Army in huge numbers. Right? So you had these generals writing letters back to Lincoln saying, what am I supposed to do with all of these people? And some people said, well, you return them to their rightful owners, their property. Right? Others basically said, no, you put guns in their hands. Right? They're willing fighters against the Confederacy. But it was a legal challenge. So much so that the United States Army, the Union Army, referred to them as contraband. What is contraband?
Illegal goods.
Goods that are considered illegal in war. Right? Okay. More generally, contraband is used but in wartime, contraband is defined as the materials of war. Right? And so, I think it's interesting that the Union officially referred to these runaway slaves as contraband, because they were no longer slaves because they had run away. They were with the Union Army. The Union Army wasn't going to return them for practical reasons because they would be sending labor back to the South. But they had no legal standing. No, they weren't citizens of the United States. Right? And until Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, they weren't technically free. Right? And so the Emancipation Proclamation enables the Union Army to take these runaway slaves and say, we now, want you to be part of our cause. Right? So, so-called contraband rebels, or regiments, I should say, were formed. Right? What's particularly interesting about these early regiments is that they were often not allowed to fight, or at least not put in the main, integrated into the main armies. They were kind of used as occupying forces in certain parts of the South, or skirmishers. Right? And my point here is that many people in the North didn't believe black people could fight. They didn't believe they had the same intelligence as whites. They didn't believe they had the same bravery. They certainly didn't believe they could be led into battle or lead themselves. Right? And so a lot of black activists fought this. People like Frederick Douglass argued you've got to treat the black soldier the same way you treat the white soldier. In fact, you've got to accept that they're probably more willing to fight and braver perhaps than their white counterparts. Most Union generals didn't accept that logic, right? They had racial views about the inferiority of blacks, which prevented them from treating them as equal soldiers of whites. Right? This changes with the establishment of the first black volunteer regiment, right? The 54th Massachusetts, right? Which was formed largely by abolitionists in Massachusetts as a political statement. They wanted to create a black volunteer regiment which could show white America that African Americans deserved to be equal citizens in the United States. And so the 54th was culled together from runaway slaves, but also a lot of free blacks from Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass's sons would fight with the 54th. What is also very interesting about it, though, is that all of its officers were white. Right? All the officers above the rank of lieutenant were white. Right? So the non-commissioned officers like sergeants were black and so on, but all the leading officers were white. That tells you a lot about how even anti-slavery and abolitionist people still didn't believe in full equality. Right? They still believed that black people had to be led by white people. But the 54th would prove an extremely significant contribution to the American cause, because they will perform excellently in the South. They will win accolades and a lot of press coverage. And they will convince Lincoln and his generals that they have to allow broader participation of African Americans in the Army. So Lincoln will actually help to establish what became known as the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, black regiments, which upwards of 100,000 African Americans would serve in the Union Army during the Civil War in USCT regiments. Black regiments with white officers. Right? But many of them were runaway slaves. In places like Kentucky, for example, they formed these regiments, and this became a mechanism for ending slavery in Kentucky. If you served in one of these regiments, you earned your freedom for yourself and your family. There was no end of volunteers. And they served with great distinction in places like Vicksburg and Shiloh and so on and so forth. So it's the beginning. This is really the beginning. It's the first step in many ways of the integration of the former slave population into the United States. It's the first time that they're treated as equals. All right, very quickly, just to kind of quickly run through what happens in the war. If Antietam is a major turning point politically, the major turning point in terms of battlefield advantage is Gettysburg in 1863, a year later. At Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee led the Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania in an effort to try to shift the momentum, because by this point the momentum had started to turn. And it had started to turn here in Mississippi. Lincoln finally found his general in the Mississippi campaign, Ulysses S. Grant, right? A general who was willing to take risks and with risk resulted in victory. It's actually down here in Vicksburg and Jackson in this campaign. When Grant turns the tide of the war here, Lee tries to shift the momentum back by invading Pennsylvania, suffers a huge defeat at Gettysburg, and after that, even though it takes another couple of years, the Union victories increase in all theaters. The last kind of major significant campaign of the war is Jackson's March to the Sea. Right? Grant, after his successes in Mississippi, moves to become commander of Union armies in Virginia, and Robert E. Sherman takes over in this Tennessee campaign and drives all the way to the sea here to Savannah, and in the process carries out a kind of destructive campaign, a scorched earth campaign. Burns, for example, the city of Atlanta to the ground. Burns Columbia, South Carolina to the ground. And Sherman's campaign is based on the premise that Union is going to win this war, and they know they're going to win it now. But what they want to do is not just win militarily, not just sign a piece of paper that said, we won, you lost. They want to destroy the South. Literally, physically destroy it. And burn down the plantations, destroy southern cities, so that when the war is over, they can completely rebuild it according to northern ideals and northern standards, right? So they want to culturally, politically, physically destroy the old South and replace it with a new South which looks a lot more like the North. And this is what later on will be called Reconstruction. It's a political as well as a physical process. So just in case you're interested, when it comes to Sherman, this looks like what you would find in the aftermath of his armies marching through. They literally crushed the South in the end. So it was all over by 1865, and then the next part begins. We got through most of it. All right, any questions before we go? Okay, I'll see you on Monday.